Okay, so I tried practicing my speech a couple of minutes ago and it sounded awful, so I decided to stop practicing and said, what the hell, let's go with it and see. Let's see how it goes. The talk is going to be in English, so the presentation might as well be in English. If you don't understand me, then you probably won't understand Professor Roth. So let's get started, okay? Welcome everybody. It's a great honor for me as Director of the Department of Economics at the Universidad del CEMA to present to you Professor Alvin Roth. But before I dig deeper into my speech, I would like to mention the following. The Asociación Argentina de Economía Política, de Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad Nacional de Tucumán, de Ente Provincial Bicentenario Tucumán 2016, all of them I mentioned because they contributed to the effort of bringing Professor Roth to Argentina. I also want to thank Julio Elias for coordinating this event and to the Banco Ciudad for the financial support of this and other academic activities at the university. Okay, that's the easy part. Okay, so now let's get with Professor Roth. Alvin Roth is the Craig and Susan McCaw Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the Gund Professor of Economics and Business Administration Emeritus at Harvard. He has received numerous awards and recognitions, but I'll mention just a few, and this is my biased sample of all the awards he has received. Okay, he's an elected fellow of the Econometric Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Sciences, among other prestigious institutions. Okay, I'll mention only two academic awards. One is completely biased. He's the 2006 T.W. Schultz Prize in Economics, and I mention it because, in particular, it is awarded by the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. Okay. The other one you all know is the 2012 Nobel Prize in Economics. Okay. Those distinctions are all very important, I'm sure, but I'm sure that maybe there are other distinctions that are equally or even more important to him, and I'll mention the following. He is in the list of excellent teachers from the University of Illinois. He has received the Teaching Award College Educator of the Year, the WIS Award for Excellence in Mentoring, the Excellence in Mentoring Doctoral Students Award, the Charles M. Williams Award for Teaching also. Those three awards awarded by Harvard Business School. Okay, those awards are just a proof that he's a great research economist, but also that he's a great human being. Okay, so you can be a great researcher and a pretty bad professor. This shows he's not. Okay, I have none of those awards, but my mother thinks I'm very funny. So let me tell you a story. It's a classic economist joke. So when I make a pause, please laugh. Okay? A physicist, a chemist, and an economist are stranded on an island with nothing to eat. A can of soup washes ashore. The physicist says, let's smash the can open with a rock. The chemist says, let's build a fire and heat the can first. The economist says, let's assume that we have a can open. Run. Ever since the publication of The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, both written by Adam Smith, people have recognized the benefits that markets can provide by allocating scarce resources in society. That is, to determine who gets what and why. Smith's invisible hand leads selfish individuals to unknowingly coordinate their actions in a way that no further welfare-improving trades can be made. In his seminal paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which shows up over and over again in many reading lists of the economic courses at our bachelor's and master programs here at CEMA, Hayek teaches us the fundamental role that prices play in achieving the best use of available means in dynamic environments where knowledge is time and place specific. But prices and the invisible hand do not operate in a vacuum. They rely on institutions which we call markets to function. Most economists, including myself, simply take for granted their existence, and like our colleague in the previous story, we are assuming the solution to the problem at hand. Our guest speaker tonight is not one more of the herd. Al's research doesn't take markets for granted. He doesn't assume that we have a can opener. Just the opposite. he studies allocations in specific situations in which markets do not exist. His papers are too numerous to list them here, but let me tell you that he has made major contributions to economic theory with real-world applications in mind when working out the math. But that was not enough for him. So he first went to the lab and conducted experiments, and then he went to the real world and put his theories into practice. One example is the paired kidney exchange program. Professor Roth did not invent the medical procedure, okay, so let's clear that in case somebody was confused, but he developed the algorithm to identify the potential matches and allocate them in the most efficient way. In 2002, only 2 paired kidney donation transplants occurred. The number has now reached 600 per year, and it's growing. As you can see, Professor Roth saves lives. But since we are at CEMA and we like to think in terms of money, let me tell you that each transplant saves over $200,000 in medical care and over $1 million over $1 million in terms of improvement in life expectancy and quality of life. This implies that each year welfare is increased by more than $700 million thanks to his work. Okay, that's a very big number. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. So I know we are all waiting for his presentation, but before we get down to business, let me welcome Legislador Eduardo Santamarina, who will confer to our speaker, in representation of the Legislatura de la Ciudad, the title of honorary guest of the city of Buenos Aires.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's see if I can work the equipment. So I'm going to talk to you about Who Gets What and Why, which is the title of a book that I recently wrote. I say recently, it came out about a year ago. And so now is the time when translations are coming out. And that's fun to see translations in a book about markets, because markets and languages have a lot in common. They're both ancient human artifacts. They're both things that people make in order to help us cooperate and coordinate and compete with each other. And just as there are lots of different languages, there are lots of different kinds of markets. And I think often when people think about markets, they think about commodity markets. And commodity markets are very interesting to study, but they're not going to be my topic today. Commodity markets are markets in which prices do all the work. So here's a picture of the New York Stock Exchange. And on the New York Stock Exchange, you don't care who you're dealing with. If you're trying to buy securities in some company, you don't care who owned them before you. And whoever is selling them doesn't worry whether you'll take good care of them when you have them. It's an anonymous arm's length market. And the job of the market is price discovery, to find the prices at each moment that make supply equal demand for each of the securities in the market. But not all markets are commodity markets. In many markets, you care who you're dealing with. You don't just want to deal with an anonymous partner. And the job of the market is more than price discovery. And in fact, I'll tell you about some markets today in which we don't let prices do any work at all. So for instance, I teach at Stanford University, and it's expensive to go to Stanford, but Stanford doesn't choose its entering class by raising tuition until supply equals demand and just enough students would like to come. It's complicated to go to Stanford. You can't just attend to study there. You have to be admitted. And the market for college admissions, therefore, has lots of institutions other than price discovery to decide who gets to go to which colleges. And in the same way, labor markets don't work by price alone. You can't just show up for work at Google. You have to be hired. And Google can't just decide who its software engineers will be. They have to compete with Facebook and other companies. So these are matching markets, markets in which you can't just choose what you want. Even if you can afford it, you also have to be chosen. So labor markets, college admissions, marriage are matching markets. You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. And of course, lots of markets fall somewhere between pure commodity markets like the New York Stock Exchange and pure matching markets like the marriage market. And one of the interesting things about being a market designer is we can see how new technologies enable new kinds of markets. So for example, in matchmaking, in marriage and things like that, we start to see new internet marketplaces designed to help people match to each other. So there's eHarmony and Match.com all the way down to Tinder, which are marketplaces that deal with the problem of matching in different ways. And I'll tell you about some of the things that marketplaces have to do to work well. But it's not just love and marriage. There's plenty of kind of matchmaking going on elsewhere on the internet, from Upwork, which is a labor market, to Uber and Lyft, which are markets to match travelers to cars, to Google and Bing and Facebook, which are markets to match advertisers to eyeballs, and eBay and different transplant marketplaces, and some of them I'll tell you about today. So let me use Airbnb as an example of a marketplace by way of telling you things that I think all marketplaces have to do. So, if I point my browser at Buenos Aires and I want to rent a room not so far from here, I find that I can do that on Airbnb. Let's think what Airbnb had to accomplish before they could become the competitor to hotels that they are today. So the first thing they had to do was they had to create a thick market. They had to get lots of rooms for rent and lots of travelers. And initially they did that by buying up their competitors, who were other websites a lot like Airbnb. So for example, early on they bought CrashPatter, which started in London. Airbnb started in San Francisco. So that way they made the market thicker. Travelers from England could easily get a place in California, and travelers from California could easily get a place in England. But as the market became thicker, their place in the market changed. And today their competitors aren't other websites. Their competitors are big hotel chains. And hotels have some advantages over Airbnb in terms of managing congestion. So congestion is what happens when you are successful in making a thick market. And now there are lots of rooms you could get on Airbnb, but it might take time to find the one you want and to get confirmed that you can go there. So hotels, like I'm staying at the Alvin Palace Hotel, they have a big advantage over Airbnb, which is if you want a room at the hotel, you can call up and say, I want a room for tomorrow night, and they can tell you right away whether they have an available room, because they can look at all the rooms at the same time. But that's not the case with Airbnb, because each host on Airbnb might just have one apartment or room to rent. So think about how much less convenient the hotel would be if you could only call about one room at a time. You'd call up and you'd say, is there a room for me tomorrow? And the receptionist would say, well, which room do you want? And you'd take a guess. You'd say room 800. She'd say, I'm so sorry, room 800 is taken tomorrow. And then while you said, wait, don't hang up, she'd hang up, and you'd have to call back and you'd say, how about room 801? She'd say, oh, by good luck, room 801 is available. Why didn't you ask for it initially? So of course, that's the problem that Airbnb faces. If you're trying to rent my guest room in California and it's not available, then you have to try renting someone else's guest room. So a big problem for Airbnb was to make this process relatively painless. And for example, early on when they were a website, you might often get rejected. You would try to rent my room, but 5 or 6 people would try to rent my room, and I would have to turn down all but one. But now, when you go on Airbnb, if you try to rent my room, that will immediately make my room disappear from everyone else's app. and browser, so that the rooms that you try to rent are not simultaneously being competed for by other people. And that makes it easier, it helps you deal with the congestion that comes from having a thick market. So marketplaces have to make markets thick. If they succeed in making them thick, they have to deal with the resulting congestion. And they have to make the market trustworthy and safe. So if you're trying to rent an Airbnb apartment, you have to have reason to believe that the apartment will look like the photograph on the Airbnb site, and the person who's the host has to have reason to believe that you will be a polite guest who has successfully been a guest at other Airbnb sites. So they build reputation systems and things like this. So I'm gonna claim that these are the three things, or three of the things that marketplaces have to do to make markets successful. They have to make markets thick, they have to deal with congestion, and they have to make the marketplace a safe place to do business. And I'm going to tell you about some markets that I've been involved in. This is going to be a quick overview over a lot of my career. I'm going to tell you about some different marketplaces and how we've dealt with market failures that had to do with those issues. And I'll start by telling you about the marketplace in which doctors get jobs in the United States that my colleagues and I have helped organize. And then I'll tell you a little bit about school choice systems in different American cities. And finally, I'll tell you a little bit about organ transplants and how we help people get kidneys. So the story about the medical markets is marketplaces have to make markets thick to work efficiently, but not everyone likes a thick market. Right? Buyers would like to see a lot of sellers, and sellers would like to see a lot of buyers, but buyers aren't excited about being on the market at the same time as other buyers, and sellers don't necessarily want to compete with other sellers. And so some markets lose their thickness by unraveling. And in labor markets, one of the ways this can happen is that some kinds of hires get made earlier and earlier. So, for example, right now, today, if someone is graduating this year from a top American law school, there's a good chance for the top students that their next job will be as the law clerk for an appeals court judge. This is a fancy job for graduates of fancy law schools. But if they have that job, they already have it today. They already got it 2 years ago, because judges are hiring their clerks after their first year in law school. Now, over the last 30 years, the judges have tried about a dozen times to move hiring back, and they succeed for a little while until they start competing with each other by going earlier and earlier again. So it's inefficient. It's hard to find the right matches after law students have just completed 1 year of law school. But there's this kind of destructive competition in the marketplace that the judges haven't been able to solve yet. But the same thing happened with American doctors, and they found a much better solution that my economist colleagues and I have helped them to maintain. So let me tell you about the history of how American doctors got jobs. Before 1900, when people graduated from American medical schools, they just started to practice medicine. And in fact, before 1900, there were a big variety of medical schools. The degree that we now call the MD became the medical degree only around 1900. And in those days, the people who were graduating from medical school started to look for their first job after medical school near the end of their final year, their fourth year of medical school. So you would look for a job in June and you would start work in July. But by 1930, the fact that some hospitals started to compete with their principal competitors to hire good graduates earlier and earlier meant that most medical school jobs were being agreed on about Christmas time of the fourth year of medical school. And when you look at the medical journals of the time, they say, hiring people around Christmas time means we don't know their final class standing. We don't know how they compare to their classmates, but we can still hire them then, but we shouldn't go any earlier. Well, by around 1940, the standard time at which American doctors were being hired for their first postgraduate job, for their first job after 4 years of medical school, was in the summer after their second year. So they were being hired 2 full years in advance. And this caused lots of mismatches. The way American medical schools work is for the first 2 years you take classes and then you start meeting patients in your third and fourth year. So at the end of your second year, when you had to get a job, you might think that you wanted to be a surgeon because you'd gotten an A in your anatomy class. But after you'd gotten a good job, because you'd gotten an A, you discovered that you fainted at the sight of blood and that you didn't want to be a surgeon at all. But it was too late because the good jobs were all gone. So they understood that there were bad things happening. And in the 1950s, the medical schools intervened. The medical schools are a third party. They're not the doctors and they're not the hospitals. And they agreed not to release any information about students before a certain date. They wouldn't even confirm that a student was enrolled in their medical school. And that solved the problem of going early. And from 1945 to 1950, they moved the date of appointment back from 2 years in advance till about 4 or 5 months in advance, where it is now. But they had another problem during that period, which is that hospitals started to give exploding offers to students. So by 1950, it was customary to get an offer of a job if you were a medical student by telephone, and to be told that you had to say yes or no to whether you would take the job while on the telephone. You couldn't think about it at all, because the hospitals had learned from experience that if they let you think about it and you later decided not to take the job, all the other people they wanted to offer jobs to would have taken other jobs. So even though they had a thick market, even though there was a time at which all the jobs were being offered, the fact that they were making exploding offers meant that job candidates couldn't consider many offers. You could only consider one, the one that you had on the phone. And it took some courage to turn down a pretty good job in the hope that when you put down the phone, it would ring again with a better job. So that wasn't a very satisfactory state of affairs either. And in the early 1950s, they hit upon a centralized clearinghouse with a design that I will tell you about that was very successful for many years. And when I say very successful, what I mean is this clearinghouse, this way of organizing the labor market, was voluntary. No one had to participate in it. And the way it worked, however, it got very high rates of participation. The way it worked was, instead of making offers by telephones, after all the interviews had been conducted, the hospitals would rank order their candidates. Here's our first choice, our second choice, our third choice. And the medical students would rank order their jobs. Here's my first choice, second choice, third choice. And they combined, after some trial and error, they combined these preference lists in an algorithm in a way that got very high rates of voluntary participation. More than 95% of people were going through the whole process voluntarily, by which I mean they submitted the preference lists and then they signed contracts where they were matched, where it was suggested that they signed contracts. But this started to break down in the 1970s. And it had to do with the fact that in the 1950s, almost 100% of American doctors were men. But by the 1970s, about 10% of American medical graduates were women. And today, half of the American medical graduates are women. And one thing that medical students can do, even though they're very busy, is marry each other. And so last year, we had 17,000 graduates of American medical schools, and about 2,000 of them were married to each other. That is, there were about 1,000 couples who went on the market together and wanted to find 2 jobs. And I'll tell you how the medical profession tried to deal with that when they first noticed that these people were not going through the match, that they were finding their jobs outside of the match, and how we helped them to do a better job of solving that problem. And so today, since 1998, there's a new algorithm that takes couples into account. So let me tell you a little bit about that story. So just to summarize the story itself, because this is something I've seen in many markets, let's say that the unraveling, the going earlier and earlier in terms of hiring people, call that stage 1. And the problem there is the market loses thickness. You get an offer at some early diffuse time in the summer after your second year of medical school, and you can't compare it to other offers because other jobs aren't going to hire for another few weeks, and you don't have that much time. And after they enforced uniform dates, they had a common time at which the market was operating, but you still couldn't compare alternative jobs because you started to get these exploding offers. So even though it was all happening in a very short time, you only got one offer at a time. And eventually they produced a centralized clearinghouse that's still working. But all of these arrows that you see are transitions that I've seen in some market or another. And so many markets, unlike the medical market, don't still have a centralized clearinghouse. They had one for a little while and it didn't work and was abandoned and people cheated on it and it unraveled again. So one of the theoretical questions that we first had to deal with is which centralized clearinghouses are successful and which are not. Because if we were going to help the doctors to redesign their clearinghouse to take care of couples and other things, then we wanted to make sure that we wouldn't do some harm and cause everyone to abandon the clearinghouse. So here's a hypothesis about what makes a clearinghouse successful. Let's say that a matching is stable if there isn't a doctor and a job, a residency program, who are not matched to each other, who would both prefer to be. And the hypothesis is that successful clearinghouses are those that produce stable matchings. And you can see why theoretically this makes a lot of sense. Supposing a clearinghouse suggests an unstable matching. So I get a message from the clearinghouse that says, you've been matched, they say to me, to your third choice hospital. Please, they will send you a contract in a few days. Please sign it and send it back to them, and that's where you will go to work in July. If the matching is unstable, it means there might be some doctors and hospitals not matched to each other who would prefer to be matched to each other. So it's easy for me to test if I am such a doctor because I'm matched to my third choice hospital. I would prefer to be matched to my second choice or my first choice. I only have to make 2 phone calls to find out if one of those hospitals would prefer to hire me than someone they were assigned to, were matched to. And if they would prefer to hire me, they might say, we didn't know you were available. We'll send you a contract. And then they call up someone else and they're saying, we're so sorry, we were matched to you, but we can't send you the contract because it turns out we have one fewer position than we thought we would. So the theoretical argument is that if a matching is unstable, then people will find ways to circumvent it voluntarily by forming blocking pairs between hospitals and doctors who would both prefer to be matched. So that's the theoretical story. How can we test whether it makes sense in the world? Well, one of my early papers showed that the National Resident Matching Program, the medical match, had produced in 1951, after another algorithm that didn't work, had produced an algorithm that produced stable matchings. So that's one data point. It turns out when you look at medical markets around the world, you find a bunch of centralized clearinghouses, many of them in Britain, because in the 1960s, the British medical markets had the same kind of market failure that the American market had in the 1940s. And a royal commission said to them, do what the Americans do. But the American medical literature hadn't described the algorithm in any more detail than I've described it to you so far. So each region of the British National Health Service adopted a different algorithm. And the first column says whether they produce stable matchings or not in terms of the stated preferences. And the second says whether they are still in use, whether they worked or not. And loosely speaking, you can start to see an association between yeses in the first column and yeses in the second column. That is, stable matchings tend to work and unstable ones tend to fail, but it's not perfect. There are exceptions in both directions. And this is one of the reasons why laboratory experiments are very useful. In a laboratory experiment, you can carefully control, you can switch with exactly the same subjects and conditions between stable and unstable matchings and see whether they succeed or not. So as we began to talk with the American doctors about a redesign, we were able to say to them, probably you want to continue to have a stable matching mechanism. let me tell you how you get a stable matching mechanism in a simple market with no couples. And this is, the medical match had succeeded in doing this in the 1950s. The paper I'm going to tell you about is how economists came to understand this through the work of David Gale and Lloyd Shapley, whose pictures are here. Both of them are no longer living. And I'm going to write this, I write the algorithm down as if, I say workers and firms here, so that's graduating medical students are the workers and firms are the hospital residency programs. I'm writing this as if the workers and firms are doing things, but for now I'd like you to understand this as the computer algorithm that operates on the preference lists that are submitted by the workers and the firms. So what the workers and the firms actually do is submit preference lists. Here's my first choice, here's my second choice. Then what the algorithm does is it has each worker apply to his or her first choice firm. And each firm that has some number of positions, say 5 positions, holds the top 5 applications and rejects the rest. But the applications they hold, they don't accept right now. This is a deferred acceptance algorithm, which means that they're going to wait before accepting any applications until they see what other applications are forthcoming. And so every worker who's been rejected at some step makes an application to its next choice, to his or her next choice, and each firm looks at the new applications, ranks them in order of its preferences without paying attention to at what stage in the algorithm they applied. It rejects all of those beyond its capacity and holds the rest. And this continues at every step. When some workers are rejected, they apply to their next choice firm, and the firms hold the best applicants they've received so far and reject the rest. The algorithm only stops when no further applications are made. And at that point, the acceptances are made. Each firm accepts all the applications from the workers who it hasn't rejected. It accepts all the applications that it's holding at the end of the algorithm. And Gale and Shapley proved 2 remarkable theorems. The first one is that a stable matching exists for every marriage market, and indeed that algorithm that I just showed you, the Gale-Shapley deferred acceptance algorithm, produces a stable matching. So let me prove that to you. This will be the only mathematics I do during this talk, but it's mathematics I can do with my hands free. How do we know that the matching that's produced is stable, no matter what preferences were submitted? Well, let's think about me, and supposing my application is accepted by my third choice firm. How do I know that there isn't a blocking pair? How do I know that my second or my first choice, which I would prefer, don't prefer me? Well, how did I get matched to my third choice firm? I only got matched to them after my first choice rejected me because they were full with better applicants. And then I proposed to my second choice, and they only rejected me when they received better applications for each of their positions. So if I'm matched to my third choice, I know that my second choice and my first choice don't prefer me. They rejected me already, and therefore the matching is stable. Let me tell you something else, though. How do we know that those preferences that people are submitting in their rank order, how can we be confident that those are their true preferences? Because when you ask people, show me your preferences, the first thing they are likely to say to you is, what are you going to do with them? And they have to think about whether they should share their preferences with you. What markets do is, one of the things that markets do is they aggregate privately held information. And the preferences of the firms and of the workers are privately held information. Well, the first theorem I can tell you is a positive result. It says that when the workers are proposing, as in the deferred acceptance algorithm that I showed you, it makes it a dominant strategy for workers to state their true preferences. What that means is it's perfectly safe for workers to state their true preferences using the algorithm I showed you. I'm not going to prove that to you now. It's a difficult proof. But let me give you an idea of why it's true. Supposing you tell me your true preferences, so the algorithm has you apply to your first choice, but you don't get accepted at your first choice. How do I know that you couldn't have done better, given that you didn't get accepted at your first choice, to tell me some other first choice? Well, when you apply to your second choice, the algorithm doesn't take any notice of the fact that it's your second choice. When you apply to your second choice firm ranks you according to its preferences submitted at the beginning, just as if you had applied at your first choice. And that means that if you are rejected by your first choice, your chance of being accepted by your second choice is just as great as if you had listed it as your first choice. And that's true throughout your choice set, so it's safe. It's always safe for workers to state their true preferences. Now, I say workers because here's another theorem that's less encouraging. It says no stable mechanism makes it a dominant strategy for all agents to state their true preferences. So we can make it safe for the workers, but we can't make it equally safe for the hospitals. So there's a puzzle that's going to come up because I'm going to show you that some very successful algorithms have lasted for a long time, and the question is, how come they've lasted for so long? Okay, but before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about the complex world that we actually live in, where doctors are married to each other. So in the 1950s, as I say, American medical students were all men. Today, about half of them are women. So couples are special because they try to get two jobs together. So in the 1970s, the medical administrators already noticed this problem, and let me tell you how they tried to handle it. And I'm always reminded just how long ago the 1970s were when I tell you how they tried to handle it. So first, if you were a medical couple in the 1970s, first you had to be certified by the medical school dean as a legitimate couple. Okay, he had to approve that you were a couple, which meant married. Then the couple had to specify one member of the couple as the leading member. And then both members of the couple submitted rank order lists that looked just as if they were not a couple, just as if they were single. So the grammar of your rank order list was my first choice, my second choice, my third choice. And both members of the couple, they could talk to each other, but they both had to submit lists that looked like that. And then the leading member of the couple was put through the match and presumably got a job in some city. And the other member of the couple, the one who was not the leading member, had his or her list edited to take out any job that was not in the same city as the leading member. And often this produced two jobs in the same city for the couple. But very often the couples did not accept these jobs. Instead, they got on the phone and they found other jobs. So why didn't this work well? It worked so well for so many years for doctors who were single and who were looking for one job, but it didn't work well at all for doctors who were looking for two jobs. And I like to think of the answer as being an illustration of the iron law of marriage, which is that you can't be happier than your spouse. So what's the problem with this algorithm? My wife and I, supposing, are looking for two jobs. So our first choice is a pair of good jobs, say two good jobs in the city of Boston. And our second choice is two different good jobs, say two good jobs in New York. And our third choice is two different good jobs. But that isn't what the algorithm asked us. The algorithm said, each of you give a list of jobs. And so a likely outcome of the algorithm is I get a great job, supposing I'm the leading member in my couple. Then maybe I get a great job, my first choice, in Boston. And my wife, after her list is edited to only include jobs in Boston, she gets a medium quality job in Boston. So we have one good job and one not so good job. And the iron law of marriage says we are not very happy. So we get on the phone to New York and we call up our second choice, which is two good jobs in New York. And we say to them, do you have any good jobs? And the outcome is no longer stable. Those hospitals say to us, it's funny you should call. They look at their list and they see that they would like to hire us. They say, it's funny you should call. We do have a job for you. We might be talking to two different hospitals in New York. So we go to New York and the New York hospitals fail to hire two people who they were supposed to hire, and this ripples through the market. So this was the problem they were facing. Okay, and so there's going to be no way to give couples what they want if you don't ask them for their preferences, and their preferences are pairs of jobs. So the first thing you have to do is you have to say to couples, submit one preference list over pairs of jobs. What are your first two? What's your first choice, which is 2 jobs in Boston? What's your second choice, which is 2 jobs in New York? What's your third choice, which is 2 jobs in San Francisco? But it turns out that the problem is harder than that, because when we have some households that are 2-career households, the proof I showed you that said a stable matching always exists no longer goes through. And it might be that there is no stable matching. Now, I wrote a paper in 1984 where I observed this, and I stopped there. I was a theorist in those days, and I said, the problem of couples is a hard problem. And that was a great paper, and I was done. You know, it was a great paper. So I still remember in 1995 when I was sitting at the University of Pittsburgh and my phone rang, and the director of the National Resident Matching Program was on the line, and he asked me whether I would redesign the medical match. And I still remember the feeling I had on the phone, which was, oh, I'm sorry I picked up the phone, because I knew it was a hard problem. But when you agree to redesign the market, it becomes your problem. And that was really the moment at which I became a market designer, when I decided to accept responsibility for the hard problem, as well as for, just as a theorist, pointing out that it was a hard problem. So here's an algorithm that we won't go through, but the left part is just the deferred acceptance algorithm. Except every now and then, someone is withdrawn from a position, which never happens without couples. And the reason is, supposing me and my wife, our first choice is 2 jobs in Boston, and the deferred acceptance algorithm notices that the hospitals we apply to like us better than some other people, so they hold our offers and reject other offers. And some of you have your first offer rejected, so on the second step of the algorithm, some of you apply to the hospital that's holding my offer, and the hospital likes you better than it likes me, so they reject my application. But now my wife and I have to be able to apply to 2 jobs in New York. And for my wife to do that, the algorithm has to take her out of the job that's holding her application in Boston. But to accept her, so she's not going to work in Boston. Maybe she'll work in New York with me. But when the algorithm takes her out of that job in Boston, the hospital that held her offer might now regret that it rejected someone else's offer, because they rejected someone else's offer to employ my wife, and they are not going to employ my wife. So the right side of the algorithm says, after we've gone through the deferred acceptance algorithm, we won't have a stable matching. We have to find the blocking pairs and fix them. And it turns out, although I showed you that the set of stable matchings can be empty, it never has been. So there's a new theoretical puzzle. How come, although it's easy to construct examples where the set of stable matchings is empty, it doesn't occur in the big markets that we've organized? So my colleague Elliot Parenson is a real entrepreneur. So there are many, many medical labor markets that are organized using the Roth-Parenson algorithm, and they don't fail to find matchings even when couples are present. And so only in the last 10 years have the theoretical papers been written that explain why this is true. We knew it was likely going to be true in 1995 by doing computer simulations on the data we had. So we could numerically study the market and see that the problem of empty stable matchings was not going to be a serious problem. But only now, in the last years, have we come to understand this theoretically. And I think this is a not atypical experience of market design. Sometimes we have to do things that are beyond our reliable scientific knowledge. But in doing that, we also generate new problems to understand, and theory can catch up and give us a better understanding of the markets. In this respect, matching is a very engineering part. Market design is a very engineering part of economics. Okay, let me quickly go through school assignment, which is quite similar, and then tell you a little bit about kidney exchange. Okay, the problem with schools is not that the markets aren't thick. If you are 14 years old and you live in New York City, you must go to school. The law requires it. So there's no problem in making the market thick. But the market in New York was congested. And school choice is one of these areas where we don't let people pay for public schools and to get their kids into the best kindergarten. But we would still like to use the decentralized information that families have about which schools would be good for their children. And the problem in New York was it was congested. They had almost 90,000 students each year who had to go into high schools, and they were running a process through the mails that just didn't have time to converge. So each year they had about 30,000 students who had to be matched in August, just before school started, to schools over which they had not expressed any preferences. So that was a problem for New York. Let me not tell you too much about it. Another problem in New York, it was producing unstable matchings, and principals, knowing that there would be some students they would prefer to get than the ones they were being assigned, learned tricks to withhold their capacity. So they would conceal some capacity and then have extra capacity in September when they could make separate deals with each student. So that was the problem in New York. Another problem was the schools saw the rank order list. So when families said, this is our first choice, our second choice, our third choice, that information was made available to the schools. And that allowed some principals, many principals, to adopt the strategy that we will only admit you to our high school if you have listed us as your first choice. And what that meant, of course, is even if the school system allowed you to list 5 choices, many of those choices weren't really available to you. If they were all schools that would only admit you if you listed them as their first choice, that you really only had one choice. And it wasn't safe to tell the school board, the school district, your true preferences. It wasn't safe to say, this is my first choice, if that was a school that might not admit you. You had to instead think, what's the best school I can get if I say that it's my first choice, which is a very different thing. So it's hard to give people what they want if it isn't safe for them to tell you what they want. Okay? A similar thing for a different reason happened in Boston. Boston wasn't congested. They had a centralized, computerized system, and it was organized in a way that was very well intentioned. What they did is they gave each student a priority at each school, so that you would have a lot of priority at a school if an older sibling already went to that school, and you'd have some priority if you lived near the school. And then they assigned lottery numbers to give other priority. And they tried to give as many people as possible their first choice. So they would get these lists of preferences from the families and try to give as many people as possible their first choice. How would they do that? They would try to assign each student to their first choice. And if some schools had more people applying as a first choice than they had capacity, then they would order the students in order of priority. The school would accept as many as it could. They would be accepted. It's not a deferred acceptance algorithm, it's an immediate acceptance algorithm. The others would be rejected. And after that was done, they would try to give as many people as possible their second choice. And after that, they would try to give as many people as possible their third choice. So you can see that they're trying to give the families what they want. And what could be wrong with a system like this? But just as in New York, what's wrong with this system is it's not safe to tell the school district your true preferences. Because if you don't get your first choice, there's a good chance that your second choice will have filled all of its places with people who said it was their first choice, right? So you might live across the street from a great half-day kindergarten that if you apply for it as your first choice, you will surely get in because you have an older child who is in the 3rd grade there. But if you need a full-day kindergarten, so you would like to apply to another popular school that you might not get into, then if you don't get into the risky school that's really your first choice, now you also won't get into your second choice, which you could have gotten into if you had said it was your first choice. So that's the problem that families faced. If you don't get your first choice school, your second choice might already be filled. Okay, so you will now recognize that the deferred acceptance algorithm solves this problem because it makes it safe for families to state their true preferences. I should add that, which I didn't put in the last description is that the preferences that the students submit are private. The schools no longer get to see them. So they can't adopt a strategy of we will only accept you if you list us as your first choice. The schools no longer know that. And consequently, it's safe for each student, for each family to put down its true preferences. And we did this in New York and Boston, and since then in a number of other American cities. And we saw the predicted good effects, but also some unpredicted ones. Among the predicted effects is that instead of 30,000 students in New York not receiving one of their choices, now only 3,000 do. So it solves the congestion problem. But here's the unpredicted thing. This is the first 4 years of operation, 2004, 5, 6, and 7 in New York City. And what you see here is in the first year, we get some distribution of how many people get their first choice, their second, their third, and so forth. Now, in these subsequent years, no further changes are made in the algorithm. So it's the same algorithm, the same system, working with a little more experience. And what you see is in the second year, more people get their first choice, more people get their first or second choice, more people get their first, second, or third, their first, second, third, or fourth. So the distribution in the second year stochastically dominates the distribution in the first year. And in the third year, it happens again. More people get their first or second, their first, second, or third. Then it starts to level out. So what's happening there? Why in the first 3 years did the distribution get better and better? And I think the answer is that, remember, principals were withholding some places because the outcome was unstable. But as the principals learned that this was a safe marketplace for them, they could reveal all their places and get all their students through the centralized match. And so essentially making a safe marketplace increased the number of good school places that could be assigned. So that was an unanticipated benefit. Let me move on to, I'm going at lightning speed here, but let me move on to the last thing I want to talk about, which is another matching market having to do with the transplant of kidneys. And in the US and in Argentina, there's a real shortage of transplantable organs. And this morning in the United States, about 100,000 people are waiting for deceased donor transplants from dead people. But we only get about 12,000 of these a year. So the waiting time is long. Dialysis is not very much fun. And the waiting is dangerous. Thousands of people die each year while waiting. So there's a big shortage of organs. But kidneys are unusual in that healthy people have 2 kidneys and can remain healthy with just 1. So if you love someone who is dying of kidney failure, you might be able to save their life by giving them a kidney. But sometimes, and we have a lot of living donors in the US. We have almost 6,000 living donors. Notice that means that in the US, we have almost as many living donors as we have deceased donors, even though we have only half as many transplants. That's because a deceased donor gives 2 kidneys and a living donor only gives 1. So we have almost as many living donors, around as many. In some years, we have more living donors than we have deceased donors. But sometimes, even though you're healthy enough to give a kidney, you can't give it to the person you love because kidneys have to be matched. You can't just give anyone any kidney. They have to be compatible. And this is what opens up the possibility of exchange and brings economists into the market design process. So the simplest exchange, here are 2 pairs, a donor with blood type A and a recipient with blood type B. And basically it's hard for the A donor to give to the B recipient. And here's another pair with the same problem in reverse. So before kidney exchange, we used to send the donors home and the recipients would continue to wait for a deceased donor. But what we do with kidney exchange now is we say, look, the blood type A donor can get the blood type A kidney and the blood type B donor can get the blood type B kidney. So you get more exchanges, more donations. You relieve somewhat the scarcity of organs for transplant from what it was before. Now, notice that only kidneys change hands here, not money. No kidney is sold, and that's because in the US and almost everywhere in the world, certainly in Argentina as well, it's illegal to buy a kidney for transplant. So here's the section of the American law the National Organ Transplant Act that says it's unlawful for any person to receive or otherwise transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation. So for sure it says you can't buy a kidney, but you might worry that it says you can't do kidney exchange, because that phrase valuable consideration is a little hard to be sure exactly what its legal meaning is. In particular, you might look at this and say, that sure looks like valuable consideration to me, a kidney for a kidney, that's pretty valuable. Well, we started doing kidney exchange in the early 2000s. It took until 2007 before Congress finally amended the National Organ Transplant Act to say that in fact kidney exchange is legal in the United States. And the way they did it is they said the preceding sentence, that sentence in red, doesn't apply to human organ paired donation. And paired donation is a polite word for kidney exchange, which doesn't use the word exchange, which might seem to you to involve valuable consideration. So it's legal, but it's congested. So here's a picture taken in 2006 of a simple two-way, of half of a simple two-way exchange. So the picture is taken in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm the man in the yellow gown, and I'm keeping my hands out of the way so no one hands me anything. And you know, one thing you wouldn't want to be handed in here is a kidney, and it's being prepared to go into this guy in Cincinnati, Ohio. And behind me in this picture, not here, but you can't see, but behind me in this picture, just steps away, is another operating room where the nephrectomy, the kidney removal, has just been conducted. And at the same time as this surgery is going on in Cincinnati, Ohio, the same pair of surgeries is going on in Toledo, Ohio, because it's a two-way exchange. When I say at the same time, I mean literally at the same time. This gentleman, whose name is Steve Woodall, before they took out the kidney, he got on the phone and he called up Mike Reese in Toledo, Ohio, and he said, we are ready here in Cincinnati. We've anesthetized the patients. We've made the initial incisions. Everything is good here. Are you ready in Toledo? And only when he heard that they were ready in Toledo did they go ahead and remove the kidney. And that way, both things happen at the same time. And the reason they want them to happen at the same time is you can't give valuable consideration for a kidney. That means you can't write a contract, a legally binding contract on a kidney that says, we'll give you a kidney today and you give us a kidney tomorrow. So to make sure that both parts of the transaction go through, they do them at the same time. Because you could see that if, so incidentally, what happened in this case was the donors traveled, right? So this is in Cincinnati, it's the Cincinnati patient getting the kidney of the Toledo donor. And in Toledo, it's the Toledo patient getting the kidney of the Cincinnati donor. And they get them at the same time. And the reason they do is you can't enforce a contract. So supposing they decided to do those contracts on consecutive days. Well, if for some reason the second part didn't go through, then this donor and her patient would really have suffered. They'd have had a surgery that didn't help them. And more importantly, they would no longer have a kidney to take part in a kidney exchange next week. So to make sure that never happens, we always do these simple two-way exchanges simultaneously. But that means that you need 4 simultaneous operating rooms and 4 simultaneous surgical teams. So it's hard to do, it's a congested marketplace in which it's hard to do even the simplest transaction. But that means we couldn't do that many exchanges if we had to do everything simultaneously. And what helped solve that problem was looking at the growing number of non-directed donors. So a non-directed donor is someone who wants to give a kidney and doesn't care to whom. And we have a couple of hundred a year in the United States, and you have to go through all the same physical tests and some additional psychological tests before you qualify as a non-directed donor. But it used to be that when someone qualified as a non-directed donor, they would say, well, you can give to someone who's been waiting for a deceased donor, who's been on the wait list for a deceased donor. And that's a great thing to do. You'll save their life. But now that there's this thick marketplace of kidney exchange, we can offer non-directed donors a more enticing opportunity. We can say, instead of saving one life, you might be able to save multiple lives by giving to an incompatible patient-donor pair, give to the patient in this incompatible pair, waiting for exchange, and the donor in that pair will give to someone else, and the donor in that pair we'll give to someone on the wait list. And this picture has 6 people in it, three transplants and 3 nephrectomies, because for a long time, 6 was the most surgeries we could organize simultaneously with any reliability. But one of the things you notice is that if you're doing a non-directed donor chain, it's not so costly if a link is broken. Supposing this link is broken, right? So on day 1, the donor gives to recipient 1, and on day 2, for whatever reason, donor 1 fails to give to recipient 2. That would be very disappointing. But it wouldn't be a tragedy for the second pair, because they were scheduled to get a kidney before they gave one. So even though they're very disappointed, they still have a kidney left, even though this transplant doesn't take place. So next week, they can take part in kidney exchange again. So the costs of a broken link would be less. And that gave us room to explore the benefits. And the first non-simultaneous chain was organized by Mike Reese, who was the surgeon in Toledo, Ohio, the one at the other end of the telephone. And this is an unusual medical paper in that there are lots of surgeons on it, but also economists and computer scientists. And what it reports was the first non-simultaneous chain, which when it was reported had 20 people in the picture, 10 transplants and 10 nephrectomies. And in fact, the last person on the chain, who allows herself to be identified, Helena McKinney, she was blood type AB. For various reasons, it's hard to find a match for an AB donor in the incompatible patient donor pool. So in fact, she waited 3 years before continuing and adding another 12 people to the picture. So nowadays, we try not to end chains with blood type AB. We weren't thinking carefully in those days. But what you see is it's possible to get a lot of people transplanted with a non-simultaneous chain. And one reason why we've come to rely on chains is that many patients can only accept very few kidneys. So here's a little snapshot of a data set for a kidney exchange marketplace. Every circle is a pair, a patient-donor pair. And an arrow goes from one circle to another if and only if the kidney can go from the donor in the first pair to the patient in the second pair. And this particular bit of data happens to include only patients and donors, all of whom have blood type A. So there are no blood type incompatibilities here, but there are immunological incompatibilities. I won't tell you about that today, but they're very important. And what you see is there's only 8 of these patients who can accept a lot of kidneys. All the rest can only accept a few. And that's why we transplants with just 2-way exchanges, because if you and I are both part of incompatible patient-donor pairs where the patient is highly sensitized and so can accept very few kidneys, we might be able to give you a kidney, but the chance that you could give us a kidney back is very small. But in a big room like this, we can give someone a kidney, and you guys, whoever we give it to, you guys can give a kidney to someone else in the big room, and they can give a kidney to someone else in the big room. So over time, we form chains, and those chains can be very long. Here's a chain, which is no longer the longest one we've conducted, but was in 2012, that has 60 people in the picture, 30 transplants and 30 nephrectomies. So today, almost half the kidney exchanges in the United States come through non-simultaneous chains. And kidney exchange has grown to be about 14% of the living donor transplants in the United States. It started to spread around the world. There's been a kidney exchange in Argentina at the Fundación Favaloro here in Buenos Aires, but it's complicated. It required permission of a judge, right? So Argentine transplant law is a little complex in that regard. And when you look at donations, transplants per million population, this is a graph that shows deceased donor transplants in blue and living donor transplants in pink. So Argentina is, in the running. I mean, lots of transplants are done in Argentina, but they are almost all deceased donor transplants. There are not so many living donor transplants. So in Argentina, there's room for growth in living donor transplants. In the United States, we have given how many deceased donor transplants are conducted in Argentina, based on US experience, I would guess that many more living donor transplants can be done here. One of the ways to increase them is through kidney exchange. let me just quickly say that we're thinking about other ways to increase them as well. And one of the things we notice is there are parts of the world where very, very few transplants are done. So let me tell you a little bit about the Philippines, where it's possible to get a kidney transplant in the Philippines, but very few people can do it because the Philippine health insurance doesn't cover it. So, it's not affordable for many people who could otherwise have a kidney exchange. So we're starting to talk about global kidney exchange, a way to bring Philippine patients, for example, into American kidney exchange. And remember, trade, this is a good time to talk about international trade. Trade is mutually beneficial. Every time you transplant an American who was otherwise on dialysis, that saves the American healthcare system about $250,000 in the first 5 years. That means if you've got a pair that in the Philippines who could have received a transplant, but it's unavailable to them for financial reasons, that you can finance their transplantation in the United States. So here's our first pair from the Philippines. They are this AO pair. So we had an A non-directed donor who was hard to match, but was able to give to this Philippine A patient because he wasn't very highly sensitized. And his wife was an O donor who could continue the chain with lots of American transplants. And the money saved was sufficient not only to pay for their transplantation, but you need care for the rest of your life, and you can get it in the Philippines if you can afford it. So they are home now. They've had their first anniversary. He's healthy and working. And they have an escrow fund for post-surgical care, much of which is for immunosuppressive drugs. Once you get a kidney that isn't from an identical twin, you need to suppress your immune system for the rest of your life so that you don't reject the kidney. Okay, let me not tell you too much about the costs there, and say that, just let me start to close by saying that matching markets are important. And I've told you about school choice and job markets and marriage and kidney exchange. There are plenty of matching markets that are not working as well as we would like. And one of them, obviously today, is refugee resettlement. Okay, that's a matching market because you can't just decide where you're going to live. You have to get a visa. And countries can't just decide where people are going to live. Refugees are precisely the people who don't stay where they don't want to be. They're the people who got up and moved. And if you try to put them someplace they don't want to be, they can get up and move again. So it's a matching market. And we have to learn. We're not doing it very well now. It's pretty clear that, in the US, of course, we have lots of refugees from Honduras and Salvador and Guatemala. And in Europe, they have lots of refugees from Afghanistan and Syria. And, these markets aren't working well. We shouldn't be seeing unaccompanied children on the US border. In Europe, they shouldn't be seeing families in rubber boats crossing the winter ocean. That's not the way to run refugee resettlement. So we have a lot to learn about this. And it's not going to be a matching problem just like school choice, because often refugee resettlement authorities think of it that way. They think, where should we put these people so that they assimilate, invisibly into the economy? But when you look at actual migration patterns, what you see is that people move around, right? So once you're granted a refugee status in the United States, you can live wherever you want. So for instance, we see a lot of Somalis in Maine, not because the climate in Maine is like the climate in Somalia, but because they were already Somalis in Maine. So that's one of the main centers of American Somali life. And it makes sense that refugees and migrants should settle in communities, because I live in California, and if a new immigrant comes to California and speaks Mandarin or Spanish and has some skill, like is a carpenter, they can find work and get integrated into the economy even before they've learned to speak English. They're clearly going to have to learn to speak English, but if you're a carpenter, you can find a contractor who will put you to work and speak to the customer in English and to you in Spanish. So whereas if we sent you to Wyoming and tried to resettle you there would be nothing you could do until you learn to speak English. So it makes a lot of sense to think about refugees in terms of a matching market, but it's going to be a different kind of matching market. We're going to have to learn to do it better, because in the next century, if the sea level rises, there will be lots of human migration. It's a political issue, of course, and here's Donald Trump and his immigration plan. He doesn't like it. Okay, but market design is is always somewhat political, even when you're talking about kidneys or schools or a labor market. You have to create a new design and see it implemented and adopted and implemented. There's a lot of politics to be done. So let me just conclude by saying that market design is the engineering part of microeconomics. And it's an ancient part of human activity. People have been designing markets since before the invention of agriculture. Right? Markets are very human things. Economists have recently gotten into the game and tried to understand marketplace rules enough to help build markets and fix them when they're broken. And for those of you who study economics, let me just leave you with the thought that we can learn a lot about economics by looking around us and seeing what works well and what doesn't, and thinking about how that might be fixed. Thank you.
All right, Professor, thank you very much for your talk. Take a seat, rest, and then we will open the floor for questions. I don't know if we have a mic. ¿Micrófono tenemos?
I have a question. The graph you showed before, the disease transaction and living transaction, I was wondering why the left part of the distribution has so many living transaction and non-disease transaction, if you have an explanation for that.
Well, so deceased donation is a pretty complicated national effort to organize. People die wherever they are, and to be able to recover their organs, you need a system of life support. Most donation comes from what's called brain death. So it's people who die in a hospital while on a ventilator and they suffer brain death. That takes a lot of hospitals with a lot of equipment, whereas you can have just a few good hospitals in your capital city and living donation can be done there because the donors can come at their leisure. So another way to put it is that deceased donor transplants are always emergency operations. Someone has just died and lots of things have to happen very quickly. But living donor is more relaxed. It's an elective operation. You can say to the donor and the patient, why don't you come next Tuesday when we have space in the operating room? So I think that's the story. I think if you're talking about a country that doesn't do a lot of transplantation, it's easier to start, but knows how to do transplantation, it's easier to start with live donation than deceased donation.
Hello, congratulations for your presentation. I'm a transplant surgeon, and I'm very interested to know what you think about the new wave that is talking about paying for the kidneys in cadaveric or living donors.
Okay. Well, so what do I think about paying for kidneys? Julio Elias and I have spent a lot of time thinking about this. It's against the law every place in the world except one, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And there they have a legal market for kidneys. Of course, there are many black markets for kidneys run by criminals that work very poorly, where I visited one in Baku in Azerbaijan. And the kidney donor sellers there are people from Moldova and Belarus, and they are committing a crime in their country and in Azerbaijan. And so they get very little, if any, post-operative care. So you certainly don't want to model a legal market on the black market. So lots of economists look at the 100,000 people waiting for kidneys in the United States and say clearly the price mechanism isn't working because the law requires the price to be zero. The solution would be to raise the price to elicit more supply. So the late Gary Becker used to say, there's no shortage of kidneys, you have two. there's a surplus of kidneys, but the price mechanism isn't working. On the other hand, when you see something that is against the law everywhere in the world, if it seems to you that there is a simple solution, then maybe there is something you are missing. So I have spent a lot of time trying to understand what I call repugnant transactions, which are transactions that some people would like to engage in, and other people who don't seem to suffer any negative externalities that we can measure think they shouldn't be allowed to do. And there are many of these. In the United States, a prototypical repugnant transaction was same-sex marriage. That's, two people want to marry each other and other people think they shouldn't be allowed to. And 15 years ago, you could not marry your same-sex partner anywhere in the United States. And today you can do so everywhere. So repugnancies can change, but they don't always change quickly. So I think that if we want to address this question of how to incentivize donors, we have to understand what the objections are. And today I still understand those objections only very incompletely. So I am not optimistic that we will soon be able to change the situation, but it's possible we will be able to remove some of the financial disincentives to giving a kidney. So right now in the United States, if you loved me enough to give me a kidney, you would actually incur some expenses to do so. You'd have to come to California where I live. You'd have to get a hotel room across from the hospital for a few days before and a few days after. You'd have to miss some days of work. So I think our next step is to be able to pay those expenses. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we will be able to do so in the next few years. So I don't think so. But it depends a lot. So I have to admit that I can tell you about a market where I have a good answer, but the one for doctors is not one where I have a highly reliable answer. But you are intuiting that the production function of medical care across the career of a doctor is something like additive. So you take a good resident and you put him in a poor hospital and you're doing just as well as some other distribution. But it might be a sortative. It might be that you multiply the quality of the resident by the quality of the hospital to train the best doctors. And in that case, you want to put the best residents into the best hospitals. And that's certainly the view we take about university education. We want to put the best students into the best universities. But it is hard to measure the effect of how we educate doctors on the medical health of Americans. So it's hard to make that direct comparison. One market in which we were able to measure the efficiency of the market was a uniquely American market of what are called postseason college football bowls. And one of the reasons we have colleges in the United States is so that they can play football against each other. And at the end of the year, around New Year's, the champions play each other. But we weren't very good at matching champions, partly because the market used to unravel so that the potential champions were matched to each other before they had finished the season. And so you couldn't really tell who would be good matches. And but it turns out when you have good matches, the television viewership and all the things that presumably correlate with the what's being produced in a football game go way up. So it's really efficient to have the number one team matched with the number two team and so forth. So that's a market where you wouldn't want to uniformly distribute the good teams and have them play in different teams. You want the best teams to play each other. So the China data, as you can see, is very incomplete. I visited the Ministry of Health in Beijing in 2013, and at that time, they said to me that no more than 60% of their transplants were done with the organs of executed prisoners, and they were, and my surgical colleagues in the United States said they were giving themselves a big benefit. A lot more than 60% of their transplants were coming from executed prisoners. As you say, the Falun Gong organization believes that many of its prisoners are harvested, that the decision about capital punishment may be made only after the match has been made for a transplant. In 2008, before I won the Nobel Prize, I spoke in China about organ transplantation. And at that time, they said to me, look, you are an American. You have capital punishment also, but you waste the organs. We do not. And all I could say to them at the time was, in the United States, we are not very comfortable. We don't think our capital punishment system is working so well. And we also have plenty of room for improvement in our transplantation system. And I don't think they would complement each other. I don't think they would work well in harness. Nowadays, the Chinese government has more than once passed legislation saying that they will no longer use executed prisoners. But I believe their number of transplants has not gone down, and they don't have a system of transplantation. I think that a lot of the transplants have moved to military hospitals, which apparently are a law unto themselves. So there's a big political fight in the transplant community between the rest of the world and China. And the way I see this is when I publish a paper in a transplant journal, the copyright transmission form, the form that I signed to do a paper, says none of the organs that I am talking about in my paper come from executed prisoners. And what that means is that Chinese surgeons cannot publish in the international journals. I've a couple of times tried to help initiate the beginning of kidney exchange in China. And once I had a bunch of great meetings, and I was pretty sure that on the next visit I would come back with surgeons and computer scientists, but nothing came of that. So I don't know any more than that. Yeah. Well, so a very funny thing about my conversation at the Ministry of Health in 2013, when they said, no more than 60% come from executed prisoners, is they insisted again and again that the prisoners all consent. Now, of course, consent among prisoners is a complicated thing, but I think it's an interesting question of why even they feel the urge, why they feel the necessity to say this, because of course the prisoners don't consent to be executed. So there's something strange going on, and my guess is it will be Chinese people who will have to understand this and figure it out.
Yeah, I had a question about how does the college admission market works? It's similar to the high school. How does it work?
No, not at all. The college admissions market is pretty decentralized. There have started to be, there have started to be some centralized aggregators of applications. So there's this thing called the Common Application, and there's starting to be one or two others that make it easy for people to apply. And as a result, the market is experiencing some congestion. It used to be that it was hard to add an additional college application to the ones you already had made. But the Common App makes it very easy. You can check another box and apply to another college. And what that means in part is that the fact that you've applied to a college is no longer as strong an indication of interest as it used to be. So colleges, in turn, have started to look for expressions of what they call demonstrated interest. It's not enough that you applied, you have to somehow send a signal that you're interested. So visiting the campus and signing the guest book is a signal of demonstrated interest, and they track your how often you come to their webpage and things like that. So so the market is in some disarray, but I don't think it's so broken that you could get to the colleges all together to change it. So, when you think about markets that are ripe for market design, it's not just markets that aren't working perfectly. They have to be working so badly that you could form the necessary coalition among participants to change things. And my sense is that college admissions has started to work less well than it used to, but it's not yet at the stage where it's ripe for redesign.
Professor Roth, thank you very much. It was a great evening listening to you, and thank you everybody for coming.
¿Cómo estás? Qué calor, me da.